Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Security guards are trained to stay alert, watching monitors, checking locks, and walking halls that feel a little too quiet after midnight. But sometimes, what they're watching starts watching back. I had been working in private security for a few years by that point, mostly night shifts and almost always alone. Most of my assignments had been forgettable: vacant buildings, fenced construction zones, and storage facilities that nobody would bother with if it weren't for insurance policies requiring someone on site. I had grown used to the long stretches of silence, the hum of cheap electronics, and the stillness of empty properties. When I was told I'd be covering the night watch at an abandoned psychiatric hospital outside Perth, I didn't think much of it. The job came with extra pay because of the site's history and remote location, but no one expected trouble. The place had already been gutted and was waiting for demolition. My job was to keep an eye on the property from a temporary guard shack until the wrecking crews showed up later that month. The facility itself sat at the edge of the bush, surrounded by a perimeter fence that was mostly still intact, though rusted in places and sagging where tree roots had pushed underneath. The main building was a sprawling, rectangular structure of cracked brick and faded white paneling, with narrow corridors branching out like the limbs of something skeletal. The windows were either boarded shut or shattered, and whatever hadn't been taken by salvagers was rotting where it lay. The guard shack had been set up just outside the southern side of the hospital, near what had once been the staff parking area. Inside the shack, there was a small desk, a broken swivel chair, a dusty electric heater that barely managed to push the cold away from my legs, and a low humming generator that powered the bank of closed-circuit monitors mounted to the wall. The main power to the hospital had been cut years ago, but someone had gone to the trouble of wiring the surveillance system to the generator so the cameras remained functional. The monitors displayed feeds from every major corridor, stairwell, and entrance, all in black and white. The image quality was poor, and everything had that grainy texture and washed-out contrast typical of low-grade infrared systems. I could barely make out the details in some of the farther hallways, and I had to lean in close to see anything past the center of the frame. Despite how long the hospital had been vacant, the camera feeds didn't show much beyond dust, shadow, and the crumbling architecture of a place long forgotten. Still, I kept my eyes on the screens and performed perimeter checks every hour, as protocol demanded. For the first part of the night, everything stayed quiet. The wind had died down early, and the trees surrounding the property stood still in the dark. The shack was cold, and even though I wore 2 layers under my jacket, the air still crept in through the seams of the door and settled in the corners. I warmed my hands on a dented metal thermos I had brought from home, although the coffee inside had already gone lukewarm well before midnight. The night dragged on in silence, and I passed the time reviewing the camera feeds, jotting down timestamps in the logbook, and occasionally stepping outside to walk the fence line. Nothing moved. The hospital stayed dark and still. It was sometime shortly after 3 a.m. when something changed. I had just returned from a slow circuit around the south and east fence line and was settling back into the chair inside the shack when I became aware of a noise coming from one of the monitors. I thought at first that it might be interference from the generator or possibly the wind pushing against one of the old windows. But after adjusting the audio channel and lowering the volume of the small radio I had playing in the background, I realized it was something else entirely. The sound was faint, but unmistakably human. It was the sound of someone crying. I listened closely, unsure at first if I was imagining it. But the longer I sat there, the clearer it became. The sobbing was quiet, uneven, and sounded like it came from someone exhausted, someone who had been crying for a long time. I scanned the monitors until I located the feed with audio activity. It was camera 3B, pointed down a narrow hallway in the east wing on the 3rd floor. I leaned in closer and increased the contrast on the display, and that was when I saw her. At the far end of the corridor, just past the 3rd doorway on the left, there was a figure sitting on the ground. She was slumped against the wall, her knees pulled up to her chest, her head bowed forward and nearly buried between her arms. Her hair was long and dark, falling over her face and shoulders, and the thin garment she wore hung loosely around her frame. It resembled a hospital gown, the kind with open backs and short sleeves, though it was difficult to tell for sure in the low-resolution feed. The movement of her shoulders told me she was crying. And even through the muffled audio feed, I could still hear the soft, rhythmic sounds of someone breaking down in private. I stared at the monitor for several seconds without moving. The hospital had been abandoned for years, and there were only 2 working entry points, both of which were padlocked and untouched when I had last checked them less than an hour ago. I knew that floor had been completely empty when I had passed through it earlier in the night, and no motion alerts had gone off from the sensors posted at either stairwell. Still, it was possible someone had found another way in. Maybe a trespasser or someone looking for shelter had managed to climb through a broken window. I had no choice but to investigate. I logged the incident in the binder, noting the time and the camera, then retrieved my flashlight and headed out across the gravel path toward the main entrance. The building loomed ahead, barely visible against the dark sky. And the closer I got, the more aware I became of how completely silent everything around me had become. Even the soft hum of insects in the trees had faded. I entered through the side door, which groaned faintly on its hinges, and stepped into the empty corridor that led toward the central stairwell. The interior of the hospital was freezing. The cold inside the building was more than just the absence of heat. It had a density to it, something damp and stagnant, as though the air itself hadn't moved in years. My flashlight illuminated only the immediate area in front of me, casting long, unsteady shadows against the warped walls and broken ceiling tiles. Pieces of furniture had been left to rot where they collapsed, and old wall-mounted signs pointed toward treatment rooms and administration offices that no longer held any purpose. I climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor and began walking slowly down the east wing corridor. The hallway looked exactly as it had on the monitor. I swept the flashlight's beam from one side to the other, checking every doorway and corner. And when I reached the far end, the spot where the figure had been sitting, I found nothing. The floor was covered in a thick, undisturbed layer of dust. There were no footprints, no marks of any kind, no indication that anyone had moved through the area at all. I paused and scanned the corridor once more. The silence pressed in around me, deep and complete. There was no sound, no sign of movement, nothing. I remained in that hallway longer than I should have, trying to make sense of what I had seen. I checked the rooms on either side, poked my head into an old treatment room with overturned metal cabinets, and even tried the door to one of the sealed solitary cells farther down the corridor. But it was bolted shut from the inside, Eventually, I turned back and retraced my steps, walking a little more quickly than I had before, my breath visible in the flashlight beam as I moved through the heavy air. When I stepped back into the guard shack and sat down in front of the monitors, the same camera, 3B, still displayed the figure in the hallway. She had not moved. She remained seated in the same exact position, head bowed, hair covering her face, arms wrapped tightly around her legs. The quiet sobbing was still audible, still coming through the monitor speakers, low and steady. I stared at the screen without moving, and a cold sweat began to form on the back of my neck. I turned off the volume, leaned back in the chair, and didn't leave the shack again for the rest of the night. I sat there in silence, watching that single monitor, checking it again and again, half expecting the feed to cut out or the image to vanish, but it remained unchanged. At some point, just before dawn, the figure disappeared. The feed flickered once, and then the hallway was empty again. When the day shift arrived and my relief showed up, I logged off without explaining anything. I handed over the binder and walked to my car without looking back. I didn't return for another shift at that site. I didn't volunteer to explain why. I didn't want to. Several weeks later, while on a job elsewhere, I mentioned the location to an older contractor who had worked with the council for years. When I brought up the east wing of the hospital, particularly the third floor, he nodded slowly and said that part of the building had once been used for isolation and solitary confinement. He recalled hearing rumors back in the 1980s about a female patient who had died after being locked in one of the rooms for days. There had been complaints of neglect, possibly worse, but the details were buried in internal reports that never made it public. Whatever had happened there, the wing was quietly shut down, and the room in question was sealed up not long after. I never went back to that place, and I've never worked another job quite like that one. I still think about what I saw on that monitor, and what I didn't find when I searched the hallway. I have no explanation for it, and I've given up trying to find one. All I know is that I heard someone crying in a place that should have been empty, and that the crying continued long after I walked away. I began working overnight security at the Riverton Steel property near Pittsburgh during the latter part of 2012. The steel mill had been decommissioned for years by that point, and its skeletal remains stood half swallowed by rust and overgrowth, with the surrounding acreage dotted by decaying buildings and open loading yards. The company that had purchased the site intended to demolish it and begin clearing the ground by the end of winter. Until then, they wanted someone on the premises at night, someone to keep out urban explorers, scavengers, and anyone else foolish enough to trespass into such an unstable environment. The firm I worked for at the time offered me the post, promising a higher than usual rate and suggesting that the job would involve little more than patrolling a dead structure and logging the occasional report. I accepted it without hesitation. The plant sat near a forgotten stretch of train lines and service roads, boxed in by woods to the south and a long abandoned switching yard to the west. It had been one of the largest producers in the area during its prime. But by the time I arrived, what remained of it had collapsed into a shell of oxidized metal, shattered glass, and concrete riddled with frost cracks. Most of the internal lighting no longer worked, and the only functioning electricity fed the small prefabricated shack that had been placed near the western entrance. That shack became my base for the night shifts, and from there, I began what I assumed would be a few uneventful weeks of monitoring an empty building until it was torn down. During the first several nights, the routine unfolded exactly as I had expected. I moved through the designated checkpoints at regular intervals, sweeping through vast, cold halls with a flashlight in hand. The interior of the plant was quiet, aside from the usual creaks and groans that any large, hollow structure makes in response to the changing temperature. I noted the occasional raccoon or bird nesting in high rafters. But otherwise, the place felt deserted. There was no heat, no windbreak, and barely any sound beyond the crunch of grit beneath my boots. I carried a radio that connected me back to dispatch, but it remained mostly silent throughout the night, broken only by brief check-ins or the occasional static burst caused by interference. The strangeness began sometime during my second week. I started to notice odd fluctuations in the radio signal. It wasn't the usual scratchy interference or garbled words from a distant frequency. What came through sounded like overlapping voices, low and nearly inaudible, as though someone were speaking in hushed tones directly into the frequency I was monitoring. I could not distinguish any clear words or identify what language, if any, they were speaking. It sounded layered, like multiple conversations were occurring at once, each too quiet and distorted to isolate. These sounds did not occur randomly. They arrived at the same time each night, always between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m. During every other hour of the shift, the radio remained silent except for dispatch or background static. But as the clock crept toward the middle of the night, the murmuring would begin again, always faint at first, then growing in tone without ever becoming loud. It did not matter which part of the factory I was in or whether I tried switching frequencies. The effect followed me, constant in its pattern, unwavering in its timing. I attempted to rationalize it. I thought it might be a strange environmental echo or some bleed over from a nearby industrial band. I replaced the radio unit with a backup. The same thing happened the following night. Eventually, I stopped trying to explain it and simply noted its occurrence in my log, though I made sure to phrase it in vague terms so I wouldn't be accused of exaggerating or inventing things out of boredom. Despite my unease, I continued the job and stuck to my patrols, until the night I heard the crying. It was sometime after 2:15 a.m. when it happened. I had just finished checking the south maintenance corridor and was walking back toward the eastern section of the building, where one of the original furnace chambers was located. That section had been mostly sealed off during shutdown. The equipment inside hadn't been powered in over a decade, and the area was not part of my required route. I usually avoided it because it felt unnecessarily exposed, its skeletal furnace supports looming out of the dark like rusted ribs. On that night, though, as I neared the junction where the maintenance hall curved east, I heard something new through the radio. It was not whispering this time. It was weeping. Clear, human, and unmistakably close. The sound came through the radio as if someone were crying into a microphone only inches away. The voice belonged to a woman, or at least it sounded like one. The sobs were uneven and raw, filled with the kind of desperate, choking sorrow that makes your skin go cold. There was no background static, no distortion, just the sharp, breathless sound of someone who had been crying for a long time and could not stop. I turned the volume down, expecting the crying to fade, but it didn't. Instead, it became stronger. I could hear it not just through the device, but in the hallway around me, as if the sound had transferred into the space itself. My chest tightened, and I felt something shift in the air, a kind of heaviness that seemed to draw me forward, despite the part of me screaming that I should go the other way. I walked down the corridor and pushed open the rusted side door into the east furnace chamber. The temperature changed the moment I entered. The cold vanished. The room was filled with dense, suffocating heat that hit me like a blast furnace, despite the dead state of all the machinery. My skin became clammy within seconds. The smell that filled the chamber was foul. Burned oil, scorched dust, and something heavier that I could not immediately place. It reminded me of rotting insulation, soaked in chemicals and cooked over open flame. It curled in my throat and made my eyes sting. I swept my flashlight along the walls, pausing on the enormous housing of the old furnace structure. It sat in the far corner like a massive sleeping thing, surrounded by rust-stained scaffolding and buckled metal platforms. Just above the furnace opening, my light caught a series of black marks on the concrete wall. Handprints, smudged and overlapping. They looked recent. The soot had been disturbed, as if someone had pressed their palms flat against the wall with considerable force. Some of the prints were large, clearly adult-sized. Others were smaller, much smaller. My legs began to feel heavy, but I couldn't look away. The air pressed against me like a wave, thick and hot, as I slowly stepped back toward the doorway. Then, something on the floor caught my attention. In the dust-covered concrete near the furnace's base, I saw the faint outline of a footprint. Bare, not made by boots or shoes. It hadn't been there moments earlier. I stared at it, and as I did, another one formed just ahead of it. I watched the heels settle into the dust, followed by the ball of the foot, then the toes, each one defined and precise. Another followed, then another. They were moving in a line, each step manifesting slowly, clearly, as if something unseen were walking toward me from the shadows behind the furnace structure. There was no sound of breathing, no shifting of weight, no indication that anything was there physically. But the prints kept appearing, one after the other, gradually closing the distance between whatever it was and the place where I stood. I did not wait to see how close it intended to get. I turned and left the chamber as quickly as my legs would carry me, not running, not yelling, just moving with a level of urgency I had never known before. The heat did not follow me into the hallway. The air returned to its bitter chill. By the time I reached the shack, my face was damp with sweat and my hands were trembling. I sat behind the desk for less than a minute before deciding I was done for the night. I left the building without logging out. I didn't bother collecting my equipment. I got in my car and drove away without looking back. The following morning, I refused to return to the site. I told my supervisor that I would not be finishing the assignment and didn't provide any additional explanation. I avoided calls from the company over the next several days. I didn't care about the final paycheck or retrieving the rest of my gear. I had no desire to be near that building again. But a few days later, I received a call from one of the other guards who had taken a daytime shift. He told me something had been discovered during a walkthrough of the east furnace chamber, inside the old furnace mouth, well beyond where I had ever set foot. My uniform jacket had been found hanging from one of the thick overhead pipes. It had not been discarded or tossed aside. The jacket had been carefully placed, the sleeves folded neatly, the collar aligned, as though someone had taken the time to hang it there deliberately. I had no memory of removing it. I had fled that room wearing the same clothes I had arrived in, but somehow the jacket had ended up exactly where I had sworn I had never been. I never returned to that plant. I never filed a formal report. In the years since, I have avoided overnight security work altogether. I try not to dwell on what I saw that night, or what I didn't see but knew was there, walking step by step through the dust in a room that should have been empty. And though I sometimes still carry a radio for work, I never turn it on during the early morning hours. I do not want to hear what might be waiting on the other end. Back in 2007, I was working night security shifts at one of Detroit's older hospitals. A sprawling structure that had been expanded and reworked so many times over the decades that it often felt more like a maze than a functional medical facility. My post for that month was in the lower levels of the hospital, a subfloor that sat just above the basement and was mostly made up of back corridors, maintenance access points, and long-forgotten storage rooms. Most of the staff avoided it when they could. It was cold down there, not just in temperature, but in atmosphere. The walls were lined with a dull green tile that reflected the flickering fluorescent lights in a way that made every corner seem deeper than it really was. It was the kind of place where you could hear your own breathing a little too clearly when the air vents shut off. At the far end of the main hallway on that level was the hospital morgue. It was an older installation, likely original to the building, and secured with a heavy, steel-reinforced door. The lock mechanism consisted of an internal bolt, an external steel latch, and a keypad entry system. It was supposed to be triple locked every night before the pathology staff left for the evening. After 11 p.m., no one was authorized to enter or exit the morgue until the following morning, unless there was a very specific emergency. And even then, it had to be signed off by a supervisor and cleared through security. I never had any business going inside the morgue itself. My responsibility was simply to patrol the corridor, check the exterior doors, monitor the hallway cameras, and ensure that restricted areas stayed restricted. The first few nights of that assignment were uneventful. The halls were as quiet as I remembered them from previous shifts, and I made my rounds without incident. Then, about a week into the rotation, I began noticing something unusual. During my first sweep of the night, typically just after midnight, I would always make a point to pass by the morgue and inspect the lock, even though it wasn't technically part of my checklist. I had seen it enough times to know how the lock indicators were supposed to look when properly secured. Everything seemed normal during those early checks. But later in the night, during my second or third loop through the lower hallway, I started finding the morgue door partially open. It wasn't wide open, and it never looked forced. Instead, it would be just barely cracked, open by maybe an inch or two at most, just enough to make me stop. At first, I assumed someone from maintenance or pathology had gone in late and failed to close it properly. Maybe they had trouble with the latch. I pushed the door shut again each time and logged the incident as a minor security irregularity. But after 3 nights in a row of finding the morgue door open at nearly the same time, between 1:30 and 2 o'clock in the morning, I stopped assuming it was an accident. Before each shift began, I made a point to examine the door carefully. I pulled on the handle to make sure it was sealed. I checked the keypad to confirm it was locked and confirmed the bolt was engaged. Every time, the door was secure. Yet, later in the night, the pattern repeated itself. I would walk that corridor, and there it would be, open again by just an inch or two, as though someone had slipped inside or out and hadn't bothered to close it fully behind them. When I checked the security footage from the hallway camera, I found nothing useful. The cameras had infrared sensors and motion triggers that were supposed to activate whenever anyone walked through that corridor. But on the nights in question, there were no motion flags, no visible entries or exits. The only thing I saw was a single frame change, as if the footage had skipped forward by less than a second. In one frame, the door was closed. In the next, it was open. No visible movement in between. Just an unexplained gap. I reported the issue to my supervisor, and a technician from maintenance came down to inspect the door hardware. They disassembled the latch and bolt housing, checked the keypad, and ran a few diagnostics on the electronic locking system. So, according to their report, everything was working as designed. They chalked the incidents up to human error or possibly faulty memory on my part. I didn't press the issue. There was no way to prove otherwise. Still, something about the situation left me uneasy. I've worked in enough hospitals to know that strange things happen. Things that don't always make it into reports. But I also know when I'm being made to feel like I'm imagining things. So instead of pushing for more answers, I decided to set a simple trap. Not for anyone else, but for myself. I needed confirmation that something was genuinely happening. That next night, just before midnight, I took a metal chair from the staff break room and carried it down to the corridor outside the morgue. I placed the chair directly in front of the door, positioning it so that the door wouldn't be able to open without knocking it over. Then, using a piece of yellow chalk I had found in the janitor's closet, I carefully traced the outline of each chair leg onto the tile. I stood back and double-checked the placement. If the chair moved even slightly, I would know. I resumed my rounds as usual, making my way down through the darkened storage hallways, past the elevator shaft and the maintenance wing. I took a slow walk through the stairwell, checked the fire doors, then looped back toward the corridor where the morgue was located. It had been just over 40 minutes. As I turned the corner into the hallway, I saw immediately that something had changed. The chair had been knocked over. It lay on its side, one of the legs bent slightly at the joint, as though it had been kicked or pushed with enough force to twist the metal. The chalk outlines I had drawn were no longer clean. The marks had smeared and dragged across the tile in a diagonal trail, as though the chair had been pulled back a few inches before it had fallen. The morgue door stood wide open. This was the first time I'd seen it fully ajar. The overhead fluorescent lighting inside the morgue was dimmed, running on backup mode, which cast the entire room in a cold, pale green hue. The interior was silent. No footsteps, no voices, no ambient sounds from equipment. Just the hollow stillness of a sealed, refrigerated space. I stepped forward and entered the room. The temperature was noticeably colder inside, far colder than it should have been for a standard refrigeration unit. I could feel the change in the air immediately. My breath formed a visible cloud as I exhaled. The floor had patches of condensation that made my boots slip slightly as I walked. The entire room felt like it had been overcooled, as though the refrigeration had surged well beyond its set limits. The morgue itself was unoccupied. No bodies on the gurneys, no medical personnel in sight. On the far wall was the bank of body drawers, each sealed with a stainless steel door and labeled with a number and date. Most of them had not been in use since the weekend, and I had seen no transport orders for new arrivals. As I approached the center of the wall, I saw something that made me stop. On the surface of one of the drawers, third from the bottom, center row, was a single, clear handprint. It was perfectly outlined against the condensation. 5 fingers, slightly long and widely spaced, pressed flat against the metal, as though someone had been on the other side. pushing from within. The print was dry. The rest of the surface was slick with moisture, but the handprint had resisted it entirely. It hadn't been wiped on. It had been pressed into place. The temperature difference between the print and the surrounding metal had created a sharp contrast that made it stand out as though it had just appeared. I didn't move any closer. I didn't touch the drawer or attempt to open it. I stood there, flashlight still pointed at that perfect, cold handprint, and waited for a long time. I didn't know what I was waiting for. Maybe a sound, maybe a movement. Nothing happened. Eventually, I turned and walked out of the room. I closed the morgue door behind me and manually secured the lock. I made no mention of the handprint in my report. 2 days later, I was sitting in the cardiac wing break room during a lull in my shift. One of the senior nurses, an older woman who had worked there since the early 1980s, happened to pass through and struck up a casual conversation. When I mentioned my previous assignment near the morgue, her expression changed subtly. Her tone dropped just slightly when she asked me whether anyone had ever told me about the orderly who had died down there. I told her I hadn't heard anything. She explained that years ago, sometime during the early part of that decade, there had been a massive power outage that affected the entire block. Backup generators had failed in some parts of the hospital. Certain electronic locks froze, and the emergency lights flickered intermittently. A night orderly who had been working alone down in the morgue was reported missing the next morning. When staff returned and power was finally restored, they found him dead, locked inside one of the body drawers. Somehow, the internal release had jammed. There had been no way to open it from inside. She told me the incident had never been made public. There had been no formal acknowledgement from the hospital, no internal memo, no funeral notice. The man's name had been removed from the schedule, and the entire story was buried in silence. I didn't ask which drawer it had been. I didn't want to know. That same week, I submitted a formal request to be transferred to another part of the hospital. 2 weeks later, I was reassigned to a different building on the campus. My new post was upstairs, in a well-lit wing that stayed busy even during the overnight hours. I never worked in the lower levels again. I still remember the sharp drop in temperature inside that morgue. I still remember the way the chair had been dragged and toppled, the smudged chalk, and the cold, dry outline of a hand that had no reason to be there. I think about that drawer more often than I'd like to admit. And sometimes I wonder if anyone else ever saw what I saw, or if the hallway still opens that door on its own, just a few inches at a time. I had grown accustomed to the strange stillness that filled the Peachtree Summit Tower after midnight. The way the building seemed to exhale once the last office lights clicked off, and the corridors settled into silence. For over 3 years, I had walked the same patrol routes, passed through the same long, echoing hallways, and swiped my badge at the same motionless checkpoints, slowly developing an almost subconscious familiarity with every hum, every flicker, every mechanical creak the structure gave off. Located in the heart of downtown Atlanta, the 20-story tower was rarely ever fully empty. City employees came and went, cleaning crews shuffled in and out, and security staff like me stayed long after the final elevator chimed shut. Yet, even with all that residual energy left behind by the day, there was something about those early morning hours that made the building feel not merely quiet, but watchful, like it had turned inward and was listening to itself breathe. For the longest time, the elevators had been nothing more than a part of the background. 4 chrome-paneled cars lined up near the rear of the marble lobby, their digital indicators blinking steadily as they responded to floor calls during the day and mostly sat idle at night. But sometime in early October of 2014, one of them began behaving in ways I couldn't easily explain. It wasn't dramatic, at least not at first. I began noticing that elevator B, the second from the left, would begin moving shortly after 2 a.m., rising several floors, pausing and returning to the ground level without any card entries logged, and without any corresponding foot traffic captured on the hallway cameras. The first night I saw it, I assumed someone from a legal firm or tech office had stayed late and forgotten to clock out properly. By the third night, when I checked the cameras and saw no one getting on or off at any floor, I started to feel uneasy. What unsettled me wasn't just the movement itself, but the pattern it began to follow. This wasn't random shifting caused by mechanical drift or a misfiring sensor. The car would rise from the lobby to the 14th floor, sit there with its doors open for exactly 21 seconds, then drop down to the first floor, pause briefly, and begin again, up to the 11th, then down to 3, then all the way up to 17. Sometimes it would skip floors entirely. Other times it would stop at every third level, almost like it was following a rhythm that only it understood. I checked the internal call logs and found nothing. There were no card swipes recorded during those windows, no maintenance overrides entered into the system, and none of the other night staff had reported anything unusual. It was just that one elevator, drifting up and down through the dead hours of the morning, as if following some quiet compulsion. By the 5th night, I had stopped pretending it was something benign. I remember sitting behind the security desk at around 3:30 a.m., the building empty except for one maintenance worker somewhere on the 3rd floor, and watching as the elevator repeated the same movement, from 1 to 19, then back to 5, then up again. I leaned closer to the monitor, transfixed by the mechanical precision of its motion, unnerved by the fact that no one had activated it. And yet it continued to behave as though it had somewhere urgent to be. At 3:42 a.m., after watching it cycle for nearly an hour, I left the security booth and crossed the lobby to investigate, the polished floor reflecting my steps as I approached the waiting car. The elevator doors opened before I touched the call button, sliding apart within their usual quiet hiss to reveal a perfectly lit interior, empty and still, the overhead panel displaying the number 1. I stepped inside without much hesitation, thinking that maybe I'd press a few buttons, run a manual reset, then ride it once through the full sequence to observe. But the moment I was fully inside, before my hand even reached the control panel, every single floor button lit up simultaneously. The lights didn't blink in succession or flicker with uncertainty. They illuminated all at once, bright and uniform, as if the elevator had made the decision for me and had no intention of asking where I wanted to go. There was no delay before the car began to rise. The elevator didn't hum into motion like it usually did. Instead, it surged upward with a sudden mechanical urgency that jolted my knees slightly and made the air feel thinner. The numbers above the door flashed by rapidly. 6, 9, 11, 13. And within seconds, the car came to a stop on the 19th floor, landing with a heavy, abrupt jolt that sent a dull vibration up the walls. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, all of the lights went out. The overhead bulbs shut off. The illuminated floor indicators faded to black. Even the emergency LED that was hardwired into the control panel failed to glow. I stood in the darkness, unable to see my own hands, surrounded by a silence so complete it felt almost manufactured. The air in the car felt colder now, the kind of cold that seemed to settle beneath the skin, not from the temperature, but from the absence of something essential: light, sound, movement, even time. A second later, I heard the doors begin to part, the grinding noise louder now in the silence, and I saw, or rather didn't see, what lay beyond. The hallway in front of me should have been illuminated by motion-sensing lights, a safety feature installed on every floor the previous year. But what I stepped into was not simply dark. It was a kind of blankness that devoured any hope of contrast. No faint light spilled in from side offices. No green glow marked the location of an exit. There was only blackness, heavy and flat, pressing in on all sides as I took one cautious step out into the corridor. The silence deepened as I moved forward, and for a brief moment I thought perhaps the elevator had powered down and would soon reset. But then I heard the sound that has stayed with me in the years since. It came from directly behind me, close enough that I could feel a change in the air. A slow, deliberate inhale, followed by another. Not wheezing, not frantic, just the quiet, wet rhythm of someone or something breathing in the dark. The sound was close enough that I should have been able to feel warmth on the back of my neck, but the only sensation I registered was the strange, inexplicable certainty that I was no longer alone. I turned, expecting to see the open doors of the elevator behind me. But the car was no longer there. What met me instead was a flat, unbroken wall of concrete, seamless, unmarked, and utterly silent. There was no seam in the floor, no faint outline where the doors had been. It was as though the elevator had never existed, as if I'd stepped out into a place where the rules of the building had quietly stopped applying. My hand trembled as I reached out and touched the wall, the cold surface firm beneath my fingertips, real in a way that made the impossibility of it even worse. Behind me, the breathing had stopped, but the weight of its presence lingered. Without waiting to hear whether it would start again, I turned and began walking, carefully at first. Then, with growing urgency, as I scanned the walls for the stairwell door, I found it more by muscle memory than by sight. The heavy push bar clicking under my hand as I burst through it and into the familiar concrete stairwell beyond. The lights here were flickering, dim but thus blessedly present, and I descended all 19 flights without stopping, my boots striking each step harder than necessary, as if the sound of motion might keep whatever had been behind me from following. When I reached the lobby again, I didn't stop to look back. I didn't check the monitor. I didn't even sit down at the desk. I stood there, trying to catch my breath, staring at the closed elevator doors from across the room, half expecting them to open again and reveal something I hadn't noticed the first time. But nothing happened. The lobby remained still. The building seemed to return to its usual state of quiet detachment, as if it had never revealed anything to me at all. I reported the event, sticking to technical language. A mechanical failure, a lighting issue, a control malfunction. I didn't mention the sound I heard, nor the wall where no wall should have been. When the building manager reviewed my statement, he barely reacted. He simply told me that the 19th floor was being permanently decommissioned, that it was no longer part of our rounds, and that no further maintenance would be scheduled for that level. He offered no explanation. He didn't seem surprised. I checked the floor plan again later that week and found that the 19th floor had been listed as inactive for several years. No tenants had occupied it. No power usage had been recorded. No cleaning schedules were assigned. It existed only on paper, like a room forgotten in the back of an old blueprint, still there but never meant to be opened again. After that night, I avoided elevator B entirely. I took the stairs more often, even when I didn't need to. I completed my rounds with less enthusiasm, often skipping the upper floors altogether, content to stay within the parts of the building that obeyed the rules I understood. But sometimes, in those long hours between 2 and 4, I'd still see it move on the monitors, quietly, efficiently, going from one floor to another, stopping at 19, staying there just a little too long before returning to the ground level without explanation. And though I never set foot in it again, I never forgot the feeling of that hallway. The silence, the breathing, the wall where a doorway had just been. And no matter how many times I try to rationalize what happened, I can't forget the way the elevator seemed to know exactly when I was watching.